Why do I keep falling for people who pull away, who say all the right things at the beginning, but time and time again disappear when anything that really matters starts to happen? You don't start out looking for this kind of person, but somehow it always ends up being the type that you're drawn to. And after a while, after you start to get the feeling that maybe this is a pattern that you've played out one too many times, you start to wonder if maybe you're the problem. If maybe you're the common factor in all of your relationship problems. And I want to show you today that that's a good place to be in, because that's going to be your springboard to understanding yourself and your own choices a lot better. So if you're tired of chasing connection that always ends up leaving you empty or leaving you feeling lonely because you're always falling for unavailable people, stick with me, because we're going to talk about why this is happening to you and how you can start choosing differently. Hi, I'm Madalena, and this is You Reclaimed. Here we talk a lot about the lasting effects of childhood trauma, of anxiety, of CPTSD, so that we can finally take control of our own lives and live on our own terms. Wait, did you subscribe yet? I have a lot more to share, and I'd love to have you here for it. It really helps my channel grow, and I appreciate it so much. So what does it look like if you're in a relationship with someone who's unavailable? Maybe this realization is coming to you after a difficult breakup, or after you've had to walk away from yet another potential partner who can't commit, who can't give you the kind of secure and safe relationship that you're seeking, or who for some reason can't be fully present in the relationship with you. And what I want you to know first of all is that, yes, you're right. You're right to think that your choice of partners is not coincidental. You attract all kinds of people, but your inner filter is only allowing you to really connect to the unavailable ones. The available ones, you overlook them, or you reject them quickly and you pass them up because they don't fit the ideas of love that you formed when you were very little. And we'll call these your unconscious patterns of love and your original blueprint of what love is supposed to look and feel like all the way down to your body. So now we know that your choices are not haphazard and random, but you're an adult, and maybe you think that maybe because of that, you should know better. But these kinds of relationships where you're willing but the other person is half in, half out, or not emotionally fit and mature enough to develop a deep and lasting connection with you, they can be shockingly magnetizing, especially if we grew up in an emotionally ambivalent and confusing kind of home. And these connections almost always start with intensity and a whole lot of chemistry, which makes it even harder not to get involved. Emotionally unavailable people are often very good at the beginning part of a relationship. They know how to say the right things and how to show up in a way that love is supposed to look on the surface, at least in the early stages. Because they're often disconnected from their own emotional world, they tend to rely very heavily on physical or sexual connection to create closeness. And that kind of intensity feels deep and meaningful in the moment, but sex is not the same thing as intimacy. It can be part of intimacy, of course, but those same good feelings you get from lovemaking, they can be replicated with almost anyone, and they're not a good indicator of long-term connection or compatibility. Still, because the beginning feels hot and electric, it's easy for you to get excited and to feel connected. Maybe you even feel seen by this person because they're paying attention to you and because they're doing all the things that look like something real. But then inevitably, they start to pull back. This usually happens right after a moment of vulnerability or a moment of deep connection, or sometimes it's triggered just by you wanting more closeness, more clarity, more emotional availability than they're able to give. And now suddenly they're not texting back as quickly. They're busy with work. They need space. Their life gets complicated almost overnight. Now, a securely attached person might notice this shift in energy and think, something's off here. They'd recognize the sudden distance as a big red flag. But if you're stuck in this pattern, you probably don't pull back. In fact, you might double down at this point because the relationship started so fast that the intensity has already created the illusion of intimacy. So now you feel like something meaningful is slipping away, and the only way to hold on to it is to start working harder. And you do this because the relationship itself is triggering a core wound for you. And that core wound tells you that you have to work for love, that you have to earn it with good behavior or with a lot of effort, or with doing a lot to keep the connection going. So you start doing all of the emotional heavy lifting. You show up more. You try to fix whatever seems to have broken. You try to bend yourself in whatever shape you think is required of you to keep this thing going. You become more patient, more flexible, more understanding. But now the whole thing is lopsided. And the more you try to give emotionally, the more they seem to pull away. And if you've been here before, and chances are that you have, even if you're not fully aware of it, your body knows this pattern. Your nervous system is already tense at this point because the whole thing is activating your sympathetic side, the fight or flight. But if you admit this consciously, if you let yourself see what's really happening, then you'd also have to admit something a little bit harder. That this is the beginning of the end of another one of these almost relationships, and this thing is on the same course. And maybe worst of all, that you chose it again. Because even though the faces are different, the story always feels the same. You keep finding people who can't meet you emotionally. And then you wonder if it's something about you that's unlovable or not enough. But when someone is emotionally unavailable, they don't pull away because of something you said or of something you did. They were always going to pull away. This is their own pattern in relationships with you or with anyone else. Their unavailability isn't personal to you, it's structural. This is why unavailability usually looks like a long string of short relationships, 1 or 2 years, or situationship after situationship, or casual setups that never go anywhere. A lot of the time you'll find emotionally unavailable people in multiple relationships at once because you can fake emotional intimacy with several people. But it's very difficult to have real emotional closeness with multiple partners. This is why we say that relationships take work, right? Because ongoing emotional closeness does take work. It takes nurturing and time and effort, and it's hard to spread that kind of effort around to several people. For many of us, it's challenging enough with one person. But when you keep relationships at the surface level, the moment it reaches the point where you can't fake emotional intimacy anymore through sex or through intensity, you have to bail. And most people don't do this because they're cruel or because they're manipulative, but because they genuinely don't have the internal skills for long-term closeness. So when things get real, they disappear quickly. And there doesn't necessarily need to be a triggering event. There's no perfect sentence you could have said, no perfect version of you that would have convinced them to stay. The problem isn't that you're too much or that you're not enough. The problem is that your own pattern of choosing people is leading you to those who can't meet you halfway. And as long as you keep chasing emotionally unavailable people, you'll keep reinforcing the belief that no one ever can. So why are you attracted to these kinds of dynamics in the first place? Because after a string of these kinds of connections, it's easy to start believing that real healthy relationships just aren't in the cards for you. And then to get discouraged and feel like there's something wrong with you, or there's something unworthy about you, or like you just don't know how to attract emotionally whole people, even when you consciously think that you want to very much. But there's another layer to this story. You get involved with emotionally unavailable people because there is something inside of you that is standing in the way of connecting to a person who's truly available. The reality of the situation and the part that most people have trouble understanding and being able to accept is that you, on one hand, are attracted to this person specifically because you can sense that they are emotionally unavailable and that they're unable to offer you a validating and loving relationship. They, on the other hand, are attracted to you because they can sense that you have some blocks yourself, some impediments that prevent you from truly trusting stable and present love. They don't have that to offer anyway, and they sense most likely unconsciously that you also cannot connect in a completely healthy way. So they feel that they don't have to be fully present with you, and this makes it safer for them, right? When you don't have the tools or the ability for healthy connection, connecting with someone who's unable to receive is so much easier. And in this way, you're two people enacting a maladapted piece of theater about love that so often and so very predictably ends in heartbreak. And I laugh a little bit, but I laugh with a bit of pain in my heart because I've been there. Most of us have. And do you do this consciously? It's unlikely. Your nervous system is wired to seek out what it knows, and what it knows was shaped by your earliest experiences. Especially if you grew up in an environment where your emotional needs were consistently unmet. That doesn't necessarily mean your childhood was abusive. In fact, a lot of people with this pattern come from homes that looked completely normal on the outside. Maybe you were loved, but mostly conditionally. Maybe no one ever asked you how you were feeling. Maybe no one noticed when you withdrew, when you shut down, when you got scared. And so no one tried to connect with you at those times. And this low-level, ongoing emotional neglect became the blueprint that your nervous system now uses to define that base level of what love feels like. And that blueprint is filled with meh. Things that don't really feel like love, like disconnection or loneliness. So as an adult, you unconsciously seek out what feels to you like home, not because you want to, but because, well, it feels right. And what's incredibly common in people who constantly find themselves giving too much and receiving very little in return, especially emotionally in relationships, is that their nervous system got imprinted by an early trauma that then led to what psychologists call an emotional deprivation schema, which is just to say a pattern of beliefs and emotional patterns that starts very early in childhood, usually at the pre-verbal stage, that has deep and long-lasting implications throughout your life. This emotional deprivation pattern is essentially a knowing, a sense that in some way your needs are never going to be fulfilled or met by another person, that you'll always be alone, that you can never truly be understood or heard, like a great big void or need that can never be filled by anyone else. But because these patterns are imprinted at the body level, at the somatic level, and they're part of our physical being, they're not usually conscious thoughts. Even if they become thoughts because we become aware of them, their origin is much deeper. Imagine at the core of you, the center of you, a space, an emptiness that can never be filled, that is always there. That's what these core wounds are, and that's why they're so hard to soothe and deal with in a conscious way. And feeling this way can lead to all kinds of destructive behaviors and addictions to try to fill that great big void. And the painful part is that you're not choosing these kinds of relationships because you're getting something from them. You're choosing them because on some level, you expect not to get your needs met by them. If you've never experienced someone truly meeting your emotional needs, like your caregivers growing up, you don't have a frame of reference for what that even feels like. It's like trying to describe a color that you've never seen. It's hard to long for something that your body has never known. That's why calm, open, emotionally responsive people often don't feel trustworthy to you. They don't feel safe, not because they're genuinely unsafe, but because they're unfamiliar. These are the kinds of people that you might describe as boring or as lacking a spark. But the truth is that they feel whole, and that wholeness is unfamiliar to you. And so what's broken also becomes what feels right. That's why many of us, and yes, I include myself here, are scared of the very thing we claim to want. We say we want emotionally available, secure love, but deep down we're afraid because that would require us to deal with our own stuff. As long as you keep choosing partners who can't show up emotionally, you don't really have to either. Real connection feels exposing. It asks you to be open. And healing this pattern means that you have to look in the mirror and start to heal those parts of yourself. What makes these relationships so confusing is that at first, it really does feel like the connection is very much real. The other person was likely open and expressive, maybe even emotionally vulnerable at some points. And then suddenly all of that just disappears. And you're left wondering if maybe you just imagined the whole thing, but you didn't. The connection feels real at first because it's presented as real. Only it's not based on depth, it's based on intensity. And intensity can fake and cover up a lot of things. It can cover up incompatibility. It can cover up a lack of shared values or a lack of a common vision, which is so important in a long-lasting relationship. Intensity can even hide the fact that the other person doesn't actually have the capacity for real connection. What usually happens is that emotionally unavailable people flood you with attention at the beginning. We usually talk about this in the context of love bombing. They mirror your energy, they say the right things, they show up the way they think that they should show up. And often they mean it in the moment. That part is real, but it's not sustainable because what they're doing isn't real connection, it's mimicry, it's performance. They don't actually know how to build healthy intimacy over time, slowly, the way real intimacy builds. So they lead with intensity. And once that intensity fades, they start to retreat because they don't know what else to do. They don't know what to follow it up with. They don't know how to co-regulate. They don't know how to resolve small or big conflicts that require emotional attunement. They don't know how to be present for someone consistently. So what you're left with at this stage is the memory of how it felt at first. And the slow realization that none of that had roots. It wasn't anchored in anything real. That's why these relationships feel so personal when they start to fall apart. Because you end up thinking, I must have done something wrong. But you didn't. It was always going to happen. The trouble is that you're left wondering why it always ends the same way, which just goes to reinforce your original patterns. You think, why does no one ever really see me? Why does it always fall apart right when it feels like we're getting somewhere? But in these kinds of connections, you were never really being seen. You were being reflected. And that reflection was based on what they thought they needed to be. That's why it always starts fast, but it fades the second anything deeper starts to develop. When we're reflecting and projecting on the other person, we don't actually have to get to know each other. That's why it can happen so fast. We're just playing with what we already have inside of us. That's why these kinds of connections are not sustainable. To really be present and attuned to each other, we have to get to know each other first. Otherwise, what we're creating is not based on anything that can last. But then we get hooked into one of these relationships and we can't seem to get ourselves out. Why is that? The reason has very little to do with the other person and more to do with what's happening inside of you. Because if you keep connecting with emotionally unavailable people, there's a good chance that you're not fully emotionally available either. Not with them and probably not with yourself. And to avoid seeing that and having to deal with it, your brain builds all kinds of interesting workarounds. It keeps you busy fantasizing, idealizing, projecting, and in general living in these fantasy romance scenarios with people who are not fully there. You keep yourself busy investing your emotional labor in these kinds of dead-end scenarios because as long as you're focused externally, as long as you focus on fixing them, you don't have to deal with you. You don't have to face your own patterns or the part of you that's also afraid. Because when you're with someone who's emotionally unavailable, you're automatically in a helper role. And when you're the helper, you don't have to receive very much. You don't have time for it because you're always busy trying to figure out how to help. You don't even have to be very vulnerable. You don't have to open up. You just give. You give and you reach for the other person. And this feels safe because you don't really have to reveal yourself. Especially if you grew up in a home where being seen didn't feel good and safe. So instead of asking for more, you just keep yourself busy doing more for the other person. You wait a little bit longer, you become more patient, more understanding, more accommodating of them, until the relationship starts to look like all of the others. You doing the emotional heavy lifting and them fading further and further into the background. But it's not just about them being unavailable. It's about how much easier that dynamic feels than being in a relationship where you have to show up, where you have to be present and in this way risk being abandoned or discarded. That's why this pattern is so hard to stop, because it lets you avoid yourself. Focusing on the other person, living in this externally focused way, it lets you stay hidden, even while you're consciously trying so hard to connect. We truly are incredible creatures psychologically, and we have some very interesting ways of hiding, well, from ourselves. So how can you stop repeating this pattern? First, let me be honest with you and tell you that it's not easy to interrupt these patterns. Those of you who've tried to do this know that this is not a surface level problem because your patterns in how you choose partners go all the way back to your childhood and they're mostly unconscious. Can it be done? Absolutely. But you have to change your approach from focusing on the problem out there to focusing on the problem in here. When you're involved in these kinds of relationships, you feel like you have no choice. Like getting acceptance and love and validation from this person is absolutely integral to your survival. This is why these kinds of relationships can become so obsessive. And this is because these kinds of wounds are based on the love that you are supposed to get from your primary caregivers. And your connection to them was integral to your survival because they were responsible for your care directly. That's why these connections feel so intense and hard to let go of. Because you really feel like you need this. You need this person to love you, to validate you, to choose you. And the only way to really break that loop is to start by giving yourself the kind of emotional availability that you're looking for out there. And I know that's really hard to hear because it was hard for me to hear, and I've spent a lot of time digging up these patterns in myself. We want the solution to come from out there, but it doesn't live there. It lives inside of us. A good first step as you start to see your own role in this is you date slowly. And you stop connecting with people from the helper role. You're not here to be their therapist. You're not here to understand where they're coming from while they give you nothing in return. Because you're not being compassionate. It looks like it, but what you're actually doing is abandoning yourself. And if you've built your whole relationship identity around being the one who gives, then this is a really good time to ask yourself, where did I learn that love only comes when I'm useful? Because if you keep choosing people who need fixing, you'll never be in relationships where you're allowed to need anything. Of course, that means that you can keep repeating these patterns, but you don't want that because it will just bring you more pain, and I definitely don't want that for you. When you stop chasing emotionally unavailable people, it doesn't feel like a grand romantic breakthrough. It doesn't feel like the ending of a rom-com where you finally get the guy or the girl who's all messed up and didn't know if they could ever love again. Who wasn't sure you were the one, maybe kissed your best friend while trying to figure it out. Getting the person who's emotionally available and ready for a relationship with you, sometimes it feels like, well, nothing. Because there's nothing extreme for you to do, nothing you have to convince anyone of. It feels uneventful, underwhelming, almost boring. Womp womp. Because you get what you need without a lot of fuss. And that's when your nervous system starts to panic because it doesn't feel familiar to you. You should be fighting harder. It doesn't match your original blueprint. But let me tell you something. Every time you notice yourself reaching for the familiar and you pause, you create just a little bit of space in which you can choose differently. And in that space, you can ask yourself, does this feel calm in my body? Does this feel safe? Or am I just trying to make this fit into a pattern that always ends up leaving me hurt and disappointed? If you find this kind of content helpful, please like this video and subscribe. It helps me keep working to bring you more videos every week. In the meanwhile, go ahead and watch these other videos on why we get involved in toxic relationships, what it has to do with our own trauma, and how we can take control and stop living unconsciously. See you in the next one.